common English. Without knowing the precise legal definitions of the words used in the law, it is very easy to get an incorrect impression of what the law requires. For example, in an area of Title 26 unrelated to income taxes, there is a section which says that the Secretary of the Treasury is to maintain a central registry of all firearms in the United States. However, several sections away there is another section which defines the term firearm for purposes of that law. That legal definition bears little resemblance to the way the word firearm is used in common English. The legal definition includes, among other things, machine guns and short-barreled shotguns. However, the definition does not include the vast majority of revolvers, handguns, shotguns, and rifles, even semi-automatic military-style rifles. At the same time, the definition includes things which are certainly not usually called firearms, such as bombs and poison gas. The limited scope of this law is well known both to those in federal law enforcement and those in gun manufacturing. But if the average citizen were to examine this one section alone, he would almost certainly get an incorrect impression about the application of the law. Because of this aspect of legalese, the reader of the law must understand the precise legal meanings of the words used in the law. With this in mind, we return to the income tax statutes. To review, Section 1 imposes a tax on taxable income. Section 63 generally defines taxable income to mean gross income minus deductions, and Section 61 generally defines gross income to mean all income from whatever source derived. But could some words in this section mean something other than what they mean in basic English? To most people, the phrase, "from whatever source derived," would seem to be synonymous with "no matter where it comes from." But what is the exact legal meaning of the term source? In each of the three main printed versions of the tax code, Section 61 has an interesting cross-reference. Regarding income from sources within the United States, the reader is directed to Section 861 of the statutes. The indexes of the code also refer to Section 861 and following regarding determination of sources of income, and specifically regarding income from sources within the United States, they refer to Section 861. While neither the cross-references nor the indexes are technically the law, they do give us an indication of where we should look next. The index of the Code of Federal Regulations, which does carry some legal weight due to the Federal Register Act, contains a similar entry. Under the heading Income Taxes, there is an entry concerning income from sources inside or outside U.S., as well as determination of sources of income, which refers the reader to the regulations under Section 861 and following. Section 861 is the first section in subchapter N of the statutes. As we saw before, the regulations related to Section 1 say that U.S. citizens are taxed on income from sources within or without the United States. The title of subchapter N is Tax Based on Income from Sources Within or Without the United States. Part 1 of subchapter N, which includes Section 861, is titled Determination of Sources of Income. An interesting fact about this title will be discussed later. We seem to be in the right place if we want to determine what legally constitutes sources of income. When we examine Section 861 itself, we find that it is titled Income from Sources Within the United States, which is not surprising in light of what we have just seen. The first subsection, 861A, is titled Gross Income from Sources Within United States, and the text of that section describes what shall be treated as income from sources within the United States. If the law defines what legally constitutes income from sources within the United States, One should not blindly assume he knows what that phrase means. Next, we drop down to the second subsection, 861B, which is entitled Taxable Income from Sources Within United States. In keeping with the general definitions of gross income and taxable income, Section 861B states that from the gross income from sources within the United States, described in 861A, certain deductions can be taken, and what's left over shall be included in full as taxable income from sources within the United States. At this point, it may be obvious that we are in the right place to determine Andy's taxable income from sources within the United States. However, it is necessary to reinforce this point because many tax professionals already know that these sections do not show Andy's income to be taxable. This is the part of the law which most tax professionals rarely examine, and when they do, they don't understand its significance. Before seeing what these sections show to be taxable, we must solidly prove that we are in the right place to determine Andy's taxable income, even though the tax professionals routinely disregard this section altogether. We now go to the related regulations, since the regulations often explain the law in more detail. The first section of related regulations is entitled Income from Sources Within the United States, and it describes the scope and purpose of Section 861 and following of the statutes. The very first sentence states that Part 1, which is Section 861 and following of Subchapter N of Chapter 1 of the Code and the regulations thereunder, determine the sources of income for purposes of the income tax. Gross income is generally defined as all income from whatever source derived, but these sections determine the sources of income for purposes of the income tax. Section 61 uses the term source, but these sections define what that term legally means. Compare this to the example regarding firearms. When the law uses the phrase all firearms, does that mean the reader is to ignore the legal definition of firearm? Of course not. The phrase simply means everything which falls within the legal meaning of firearm. Similarly, the meaning of all income from whatever source derived depends entirely on the legal meaning of the word source, and Section 861 and following and related regulations determine these sources of income for purposes of the income tax. Oddly enough, tax professionals and IRS employees rarely, if ever, examine this part of the law. But this sentence of the regulations, as significant as it is not all that the tax professionals misread or ignore. As we saw before, taxable income is generally defined in Section 63 to mean gross income minus certain deductions. But Section 861B specifically describes what constitutes taxable income from sources within the United States. As a matter of fact, anyone looking at the regulations under Section 63 for guidance in determining his taxable income will come up empty-handed. The regulations there just give a procedural rule about filing a tax return with itemized deductions versus using the standard deduction. They do not describe how to determine taxable income. After saying that these sections determine the sources of income for purposes of the income tax, the regulations explain that the statutes provide for three categories of income: income from sources within the United States, income from sources without or outside of the United States, and income which comes partly from inside and partly from outside of the United States. In Andy's case, we are only concerned with the first category. The regulations clearly state that gross income from sources within the United States consists of the income described in 861A and the related regulations. If one has income partly from within and partly from outside of the U.S., then Section 863 gives rules about how to divide up such income, some of which will then be treated as income from sources within the United States. But Andy Green